welcome everybody that's tuning in to our very first episode. This is the Power of Babble.
Yeah, welcome in.
It's exciting. We're finally doing it. Should we introduce ourselves? Just go around. Caleb, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I can do that. So basically, I'm Caleb. My name's Caleb Watson. I am a Christian. My father was a minister of the gospel for many years. I'm an aspiring minister myself, a licensed minister technically, and a seminary student trying to pursue my master's degree. But more importantly, for the context of what we're doing here, I'm a huge nerd.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Courtney can attest to my being one of the biggest nerds alive. So we're gonna be having some good conversations here on this podcast, and I will be nerding out big time. So that's what qualifies me for this.
Absolutely. And on to our next nerd. Jeremy, you want to?
What an introduction. My name is Jeremy. I have a doctorate in English and comparative literature. I am also a Christian. Shocking, I know, based on this podcast and its subject matter. Definitely a nerd, a little bit different of a nerd than Caleb. Sometimes I troll that, but we have converging but also conflicting interest in that regard.
Yeah, he's a dork. I'm a nerd.
Hey, listen, we don't have to get into
Teach
the
their own.
whole different classification system, but I like literature. I don't have any formal ministry training. I never went to Bible school, but I've just grown up in the church. I love Jesus. I've read the Bible a few times. Yeah, and so I have thoughts on it from a literary perspective, and I also like pop culture too.
Yeah.
And then the third member of this podcast, whom you heard first, is probably the most normal of us. I think that would be fair to say.
I'm going to say that I am not a nerd. Caleb might disagree with me on that, but
We're converting her.
I'm Courtney Taylor. I was previously a teacher. Now I'm in a role of a early language and literacy coach. That sounds super fancy, but I just help support teachers. I am a Christian, believe it or not.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, I'm excited. I am, I guess, officially the host of this podcast.
Heck yeah, I'm gonna keep steering the ship
Yeah,
so that it doesn't hit land.
So I'll be asking the nerds a bunch of questions, and we're just gonna see what happens with it.
Yeah.
So, all right. So, Power of Babel. This is the title of the show. Why? What are we doing here?
Jeremy, do you want to pick that up?
We're trying to channel ancient Mesopotamian spirits. And, we thought, what better venue since,
we're doing what they
witch
did
talk
at
and
the
everything.
original Babel, right? Yeah.
Yeah, witch talk and everything has taken off. Why not just do that on a pod? No. Obviously, for those of you in the know, this is a reference to the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
Very interesting biblical story. It's one that people tend to learn in Sunday school, but it's also a very weird story when you start looking at it. And as part of some of the most ancient history contained within the Bible, there are all sorts of things that you could say about it in depth. So a lot of people think they know it, but there's more layers there, and it's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's one of the it always fascinated me when I was a kid, that particular story, just because it's so weird.
Mhm.
And I like the weird stuff. I always have, but I think a lot of people have sort of missed the point of that text. But if you really understand what it's about, it's kind of a theological, like, hinge point for a lot of the rest of what's in Scripture. And so it's a super important thing. And also, just the pun of the Power of Babel is a reference, of course, to conversation. Anyone who knows me or Jeremy or Courtney, they know that we love conversation.
Yeah.
We just, anytime we get together, we just talk
It's
and
such a
talk.
joy.
Yeah, it's just endless babble.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that can be a very powerful thing because you learn from each other, you grow in discussing things and really sort of getting your ideas out there. And so that's really what we're going to be doing on this podcast.
This is about the power of yap.
The power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't have a set agenda. We're not trying to teach you any specific thing. This is not like a traditional Bible study where we hit a bunch of points. And in fact, on this podcast, we're not always going to talk specifically about the Bible per se.
Right.
But because we're all Christians, because our minds are just sort of wired to think about things through the Bible, through the lens of a biblical worldview, we're going to bring that into it, but in possibly branching out to non-biblical topics.
Yeah.
Yeah, all kinds of nerdy topics. I feel like
Yeah.
I'm in amongst the nerds. So
Yeah,
who knows?
you're
We're gonna
one,
yap about all kinds of stuff.
you're one of us.
I'm gonna be converted, maybe.
Yeah.
I love how she's trying to distance herself from
She thinks
all of
she's one of the
this.
I
cool
need
kids,
to.
but she's not.
I absolutely need to.
Yeah.
If that's what
Um,
you have to tell yourself to continue hosting this, then that's fine. We can forgive that. But
Yeah. Although she is probably the most normal person we know who would be willing to do this.
I bring the charisma and the charm, and you know it. So it's gonna be a
And the
fabulous
ego,
time.
apparently. Yeah.
I can't argue with any of that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think what Jeremy was saying about in terms of, we're not trying to teach or educate people. Hopefully, maybe you'll learn something along the way.
Yeah.
But we will make mistakes. I will say things that are false. So don't fact check me, but just assume that there are errors.
Just no heresy.
The ordained
Yeah.
minister, everyone.
Right. Jeremy's the only one who's actually qualified. He has a PhD.
Yeah.
And so
yeah.
and when he says something about what's your degree in again?
English and comparative literature.
Yeah, whatever that junk.
Which means I know like what a bunch of French people said about language.
fabulous.
Yeah.
Most of which is not true, but
I
So-
know nothing about that. So
Me
we'll
either.
learn. We'll learn
If
stuff.
he
for
says something
sure.
about it, though, that is the gospel truth because he is the doctor.
Yeah, he
now,
has the.
I don't have any kind of formal training in anything, and Courtney does in a completely different field.
I do have a master's in instructional technology and library media, so
Right.
I do have that children's book knowledge. Maybe that'll come in handy
Yeah,
here.
we'll review a children's book.
Yeah.
she can
someday.
teach Caleb how to read.
Yeah, yeah.
I need to do that. So I mean, I don't know. You're the host, so you decide. But like, maybe we should talk a little bit about the source of the-
Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's definitely a play on words. Power of Babel, Tower of Babel. So I guess our first episode needs to be geared towards the Tower of Babel. Where do we start with this? Where do we want to go with it?
Yeah. Well, out of the corner of my eye, I see Jeremy furiously looking up notes on his phone. So, do you want to start, or you want me to start? I can just riff on this for a long
Oh my
time.
gosh.
Well, before we riff, I just thought it would be good for those of our listeners who may not be super familiar with it. This comes from Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
this is, I mean, in terms of the cultural footprint of the story, it's a very, very short passage. But it's been extremely influential, not only in Christian circles specifically, but on literature. It's served, people have commented on it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years because there's something in it that I think is really, really interesting about why our world is the way it is,
Right.
where languages come from, the agency of humanity, but also the way in which the natural world and the supernatural worlds intersect. So basically, just to summarize, and then I'll pass it along for Courtney and Caleb if they want to add anything or start into the commentary. So the story starts, now the whole world had one language and the same words. And then they all come together and they decide to make a tower. And let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. That part's important. In the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves because they don't want to spread out over the entire world. God sees this and says, if they do this, if they're united in this way with one language, nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. And so God says, come, let us go down and confuse their language. And so God does this. The whole plan falls apart. They can't understand each other. There's strife that comes up. And then its name was called Babel because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. There are a few very important things in there. Number one, before I pass this over, I just want to mention the fact that they're all gathering together and refusing to disperse. They said, we need to have some sort of central monument so that we don't all like wander off. This is in direct contradiction to the creation mandate from the first few chapters of Genesis,
Right.
where it says, fill the earth, subdue it. You have a mission over all the earth. Here the people are saying, and this is the first clue that their intentions are not good or even neutral. They say, no, we want to stay together and we're going to do our own thing that reaches to the heavens. So this is in contradiction.
Yeah.
So you have to, as with many of the biblical texts, especially in the Old Testament, but also in the New, you have to really be sensitive to the subtext that would be obvious probably to the first, the original audience for this, but may not be apparent to us because we're not thinking through it from the same way. The subtext in this is that these people are coming together for a nefarious purpose.
Right.
All right, and so I'll just hand it off to y'all.
Yeah. So I mean, the backdrop of disobedience that you kind of made reference to is super super important because as Jeremy said, like the mandate from God to humanity is be fruitful, have dominion, and fill the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Right. He gives this to Adam and Eve originally.
Right.
Like this is the mandate that they have. Of course, we know what happens with Adam and Eve. They fall into sin and into disobedience themselves. And then God returns the earth to its primordial state through the flood.
Yeah.
He floods the earth and said, basically, it's a motif to say, like, this is a new creation, right? I'm starting over. And you see this because at the end of the flood narrative with Noah and his family, God reissues the creation mandate to Noah and his family. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, have dominion, right? This is what their instruction is. And so then after that mandate, immediately we see this disobedience where instead of filling the earth, and maybe I should say for a moment the significance of that. Why is it that God wants them to fill the earth in the first place? Well, because he created them in his image. And so the reason why we have this missional mandate to fill the earth is because we are intended to fill the earth with the image of God. Right? We're having dominion as his regents in one respect. We are representing God on the earth. And as his representatives, we are filling the earth with his image and therefore filling it with his glory. Right?
Can I share a hot take here?
Yeah.
That isn't really, I don't think it's a hot take. I think it's perfectly orthodox, but it's going to sound kind of controversial. The original creation was not perfect. And that
That's
is what
exactly right.
Caleb, I think, is getting at. So there's a difference between good and perfect. In English, perfect for us means excellent, awesome, really cool. Perfect, though, in the strict sense, means complete and final.
Right.
But just by having the mandates that says fill the earth, that means there's still work left to do.
That's right.
It's not perfect in that sense.
That's right. Yeah. So God creates, and he says there's this repeated motif where he says that he saw that it was good.
Yeah.
Right. And this is getting to what Jeremy's talking about this, the goodness of the earth, the goodness of the creation. And yet the idea here is that there's more to be done. And this is a work in progress, and it can become better. It can become more complete, so to speak. And part of that is the commission of humanity to fill the earth with the image of God and to subdue it. And humanity is sinful and stubborn, and so they refuse to do it. And so this is where we land here in Genesis 11, is in disobedience. The people say, instead of obeying what God has commanded us to do, to fill the earth with his image, we're going to congregate together and make a name for ourselves. It's important that the text says that. It says we're going to make a name for ourselves. Why? Because name and presence are synonymous in the Old Testament. Right. So when we talk about the name of God, that's a byword for the presence of God, right? And so like the name accompanied the children of Israel. Like there's lots of texts where you can prove that out. But so the idea is instead of making a name for God by filling the earth with his presence, by being his imagers and filling the earth with his image, we're going to make a name for ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, what this involves is, and I'll bounce this around to you guys to talk about a little bit, which is this idea that what they're doing at the Tower of Babel is they're not trying to reach God, Yahweh, by reaching into the heavens with this tower. What they're trying to do is they're trying to attract other deities or other divine beings to them, right? So that they can receive empowerment, so that they can receive knowledge or whatever it may be. They're basically contacting these other supernatural forces, and as you can see, that could be a serious problem.
Invoking Mesopotamian spirits.
Yeah, that was the reference.
So, Courtney, what stands out to you about this passage?
Well, I think in thinking about what Caleb was saying and just where we're at in history, and with like ziggurats and all of that, what was the what was the significance of building this tower or this type of structure? Is there some kind of reason, like why a tower?
Yeah. So the tower, the ziggurat, okay, the word that you just mentioned, if a lot of our listeners may not know what a ziggurat is
Hmm.
just by the word, but when I describe it, you'll know what it is. It looks kind of like a pyramid,
Yeah.
but it's got steps
Yeah.
that lead to the top. And this is a common thing in the ancient Near Eastern world. The context that we're talking about here, essentially, what we're talking about in a tower, it's not a skyscraper so much as it is a man-made mountain.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Okay. And the reason why that's significant is because in the parlance of the Old Testament and really all of the ancient Near East, there are really a couple of places where divine or supernatural beings dwell. And that is mountains and gardens.
Hmm.
Right? Mountains and gardens are the two places. And it makes sense in an ancient Near Eastern person's mind, right? I mean, a garden is a paradise type place. Of
Hmm.
course, if you're an important being, that would be the kind of place that you are.
Mhm.
And a mountain stretches into the heavenly realm. It
Right.
stretches into the sky towards beyond the earth.
It's also somewhat dangerous, scary,
Yes.
hard to get to.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I don't want to brush past this here. Sorry, don't want to interrupt Caleb too much, but a ziggurat is used for religious purposes. It is a
Yes.
temple, and this is the reason why, because it's a man-made mountain.
That's right.
Mm.
Yeah, and so God, and you can see this throughout the Old Testament, by the way, throughout the whole Bible, really, that God meets prophets on
yeah.
mountains,
Yeah.
right? He meets Adam and Eve and dwells with them in the Garden of Eden.
Hmm.
In fact, the Garden of Eden is called in the prophets a garden and a mountain,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so you get this motif where it's like it's clear what we're doing when we have a ziggurat, we have something like this man-made mountain. We know immediately what they're attempting to do. They're attempting to contact the supernatural realm, right?
So,
Yeah,
if you've ever wondered when you heard this story, why is God so mad that they're building a tall building? Don't we
Yeah.
do that all the time? This is why. It's
Right.
not because the building is tall. It's not because everybody's getting along and singing Kumbaya.
yeah,
This is the story that would have been, and the context that would have been immediately identifiable
yeah.
to the ancient audience.
It's
for
lost on
instance.
modern readers, but I like because when I was a kid, I just thought God was against architecture. Like he
Yeah.
doesn't. He must hate New
Or
York
they were
City.
trying to reach to heaven and like get to him
Yeah.
or something. And
Which is absurd.
yeah.
I mean, and it's really, I would suggest, because sometimes we think of ancient people as being dumb. They were not dumb, okay? Just because they didn't have
Yeah.
some of the modern information that we have with technological advance and so forth doesn't mean that they didn't understand a lot about the world that they lived in. A lot of this is metaphorical, right? Insofar as the heavens represent the beyond the earth, right? This is an area with which we cannot traverse. We can't get there. Right. And so there's a spiritual and metaphorical understanding about this, right? It's not so we can literally reach out and touch, some
Right.
space. It's actually, it's more symbolic of what they think that space represents.
Right.
And so they're trying to contact these beings. I think we should discuss the fact that not only do we have the context leading up to Genesis chapter 11 of the disobedience of man,
Mm.
but we also have the context leading up to Genesis 11 of the disobedience of supernatural beings,
Mm.
Ooh.
right?
Okay.
So it's part of the reason why God is so upset is because, yes, humanity is disobeying the mandate that he's given them to fill the earth. But he's also upset when he says anything that they put their mind to do, they will do it, right?
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I used to think like, well, this is crazy because they're trying to reach heaven with this tower.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
God says that they're going to do it. Like, surely God knows that they can't actually do that.
Right.
Except that's not what he meant. What he meant is what they are actually trying to do, which is contact these beings,
Hmm.
these supernatural beings, lowercase g gods, if you will. What he's saying is, if they put their mind together, they will be successful in this pursuit.
This is, to give you a metaphor for this, this is like Sauron trying to get his hands on the One Ring.
Yeah.
This is it's not so much we're going to to physically travel to a place we otherwise can't get to.
Right.
This is going to be a nexus of illicit spiritual power.
Yeah.
Or if you prefer, it's like building a spiritual ICBM.
Yeah. Yeah, and so what we have is, and maybe I should give just a little bit of a backdrop with the whole Genesis 6 thing.
I thought that's what I was going to ask. Are we tying this to the Nephilim?
We are.
Okay.
Yeah, and so if you go back and you read Genesis chapter 6, which is also a hugely important passage
Yeah.
in the overall narrative of theology, what you find is there's this very strange episode
Yeah.
where the sons of God,
Mhm.
which is, we don't really have time to go into all of the arguments
Another episode.
for why. Maybe we can do that in the future. There's lots of good scholarship on this, by the way. This isn't none of this, and keep this in mind for all future podcasts. Nothing I say or they say will ever be original to us. Where we're leaning on other people and other scholarship and things of that nature. So, if you're interested, read Michael Heiser's work. He's got great work on this. But the sons of God have. It's a byword for supernatural divine beings, right? The term sons of God in the Old Testament is always in reference to supernatural beings. And so the sons of God come to the daughters of men and bear offspring called the Nephilim.
Mhm.
Nephilim is a Hebrew word that means giant.
Mhm.
And this really upsets God, right? This is
Is that because God is just a stick in the mud? Why does God have a problem with this?
Well, I was going to ask you guys the same question. Well, for real, like, why do we think? First of all, this is a good question. Why would rebellious supernatural beings that God created, right? I mean, we often would want to think of these beings as angelic beings, although an angel is a job description, not actually a type of being, right? Angel means messenger, but these are supernatural beings who have rebelled against God. Why would they want to bear offspring with humanity in the first place? Why would they do this? Awkward silence.
That's a really good question.
Got any thoughts?
I mean,
What's
my
our
first
rating
thought,
for this podcast?
my first thought would be, I mean, free will, but did they not have free will because they rebelled and
No, I mean, I think that they have to have free will.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
the very fact of their rebellion implies
Right.
free will.
Right.
Yeah.
But
So what is so enticing then to them?
Yeah.
Well, these supernatural beings, even though, and this depends on how you interpret, Genesis 2 and 3, even though the devil or the tempter, Satan, takes on some sort of physical appearance or form, these are primarily supernatural beings.
Right.
They do not have a necessary physical component to them.
Key word being necessary.
Yeah. And so them wanting to interact with the physical world, you could see that as, and this is far above, I think, our pay grade or our ability to say anything definitive about. But it seems to me that part of this, them wanting to have, children with humanity, is something about there may be some jealousy there for the physical. At the very least, there's a boundary crossing that they should not cross, because they are spiritual beings. They are not physical beings, but they want to meddle.
Yeah.
They want to cross that line.
Well, and maybe they see, we are God's image bearers. And so is that their way of having their image bore onto the earth through humanity?
Yeah. So I think that both of the things that what you said, both of you have said, is really sort of getting towards the point here, which is, I do think that there is an element, and maybe in a future episode, I'm no promises, but maybe we can talk about the fall of Satan himself.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Because I think especially in that case, there probably is an element of jealousy, insofar as God has designated in his new creation of the physical world that humanity be his primary imagers in that world. In which case, I can it is speculative in some sense, but I can absolutely see how these other beings, who, spoiler alert, I would argue, are also made in the image of God, There are hints of this in the text of Genesis when God uses this plural language, let us make man in our image. Who's he talking to?
Yeah. Well, even in this story, he says, let us go down and
Yeah,
confuse their
yeah.
language.
Yeah, let us. That's exactly right. And
Right.
so who is the plural here? Well, I would suggest that the plural here is God is speaking to his heavenly host. He is speaking to the divine council, right? And so that is to say other beings whom God has created that also are made in his image. And again, we can do a future episode on what exactly it means to be made in the image of God, because there's a lot to unpack there. But just for the sake of today's conversation, I think that jealousy part, that there's a new kid on the block, so to speak, who is now an imager of God, and in this new creation have this commission to fulfill on behalf of God. And so you can see how there might be rebellion or resistance to that to them. The other thing is the thing that Courtney, that you mentioned, which is this idea that if God is trying to fill the earth with his image, and now we have jealous or disconcerted supernatural beings who are rebelling against God, what would make sense for them to do to derail God's plan to fill the earth with his image by trying to fill the earth with their image?
Yeah.
Right. So it's a lot of this, I think, is about competing seeds, right? Which something that we're going to see throughout Scripture in a lot of different theological motifs.
Yeah.
So I say all that to say that we have this rebellion in Genesis chapter 6, where supernatural beings have already made contact with humanity in a way that infuriated God so much that he decided to flood the earth to begin with, right? Because the immediate context in Genesis 6 is he floods the earth. And so now, again, here in Genesis chapter 11, we have now humanity is trying to reach out to these beings who have already contacted them.
Yeah.
So the question then becomes, what's God going to do about this?
Yeah.
Right.
What's he going to do? How's he
Right.
going to
Because if he sits, some people, I could see if you're of a certain persuasion of mind, you look at this story and say, well, this is just proof that the Old Testament deity is irrational and just gets angry for silly reasons.
Right.
That's kind of you have to just take the context and the original meaning and message of this text and choose to ignore it or just not be even aware that it exists to have that kind of interpretation. I mean, really putting this in context, why is God so worried about this? Why is he so worried about these supernatural beings meddling with humanity? It's because he knows that his plan is the one that is going to lead to human flourishing.
Right.
The garden is a place of flourishing.
Yeah.
He said, expand this garden over the whole earth. Now, if there are other beings who have rebelled against him, rebelled against his plan, stepping in and trying to assert their will, by definition, that is not going to lead to human flourishing.
Right.
So it is about God's sovereignty and authority. But hand in hand with that, because he's good, it's also about our flourishing and what's best for us as, an entire, all of humanity.
Yeah. And so what did God do in Genesis chapter 6? Well, in Genesis 6, his response was he poured out his wrath and just
wiped everybody out.
Yeah, exactly. But then remember what he does at the end of that. He promises, I'm not going to do that again.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's swerve a little and now let's confuse languages.
Yeah. So what's the point of the confusing of the languages?
Yeah.
Is this just to provide etiology for the diversity of human language that we...
Is this a just so story? Is this some, the ancient Near Eastern author who may be Moses or maybe not, just saying, well, there's all these languages. How did they get there?
How did that happen? Yeah.
How did that happen? And come up with a convenient story that for some reason contains a tower and all of this.
Yeah.
I would say it's something else.
Yeah. So, okay, I guess my question is there evidence to support the claim that there was only one language to begin with before this? Or, is this the point where languages were born?
Yeah. So I want to answer that really in two ways. Okay. One would be the thing that Jeremy was just getting at, which is to say that, the biblical text is interested in giving etiology, which is basically an explanation of the origin of certain things, for a lot of different things.
Right.
And that is sort of part and parcel of these ancient creation texts
Mm.
in other ancient Near Eastern religions as well. So that's just part of the genre in one sense.
Right.
So I almost don't want to put too much emphasis on that, just to
Mhm.
say, like, just because Moses gives an explanation for the origin of human language through the story doesn't necessarily
Well,
mean
but it's the story. We need to be careful here, though, because the text doesn't say this is the event that led to absolutely every single language
Right.
that exists
Yeah.
currently
right,
in human use.
right,
This is just saying all of a sudden there were a ton of different languages where
Right.
there used to be one in this location.
right. And so exactly. So we don't want to overspeak for what the text is claiming, but then also, I'm not a linguist, so
Yeah.
that's way outside my expertise. I have read on the subject a little bit, and I do think that there probably are some experts who would suggest that um, that a lot of the languages that we see come from prior primordial sources.
Yes.
And that's absolutely true. And we actually see some of the mythology that people have in various parts of the world that mirrors each other
Mhm.
is probably reflected in some of the similarity between root languages.
Yeah.
And
For,
so,
for some reason, well, for one example, flood stories in
Yeah.
the ancient world are very common,
very common.
very widespread.
Yeah.
And just to go back to the point about root languages and stuff, I mean, this ultimately, like comparative linguistics, can't really say for sure, but
Yeah.
it is curious that they're pretty much in agreement that modern languages, like for example, just take, something from the last couple thousand years,
Hmm.
the diversification of Italian, French, Spanish, all of this from Latin,
Yeah.
heavily, influenced by Latin. So we've seen this within recorded human history,
Right.
how you'll have one dominant language and then it kind of branches out. We
Mm.
also see languages sometimes coming together and forming new languages, like
Yeah.
in Haitian Creole, things like that.
That's right.
And
People from Arkansas, it's not
Yeah.
English.
so basically, the point here is that from what we know of how language changes, it is entirely reasonable to think that all of human language might have begun in one place with one language.
Yeah.
Mm.
And that wouldn't violate anything that we know about how language change works.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, part of what
Yeah.
Jeremy's talking about is like, linguists, they will talk about things, hypothetical languages
Mhm.
that may have been the root source, like Proto-Germanic
Yeah.
and things
Mhm.
like that, where you get it's sort of like a tree branch with lots of languages come from it. So I think that is part of the study, is to say that, yeah, at some point in the remote past, there was at the very least far fewer, if not one,
Yeah.
single language.
And this, by the way, gets into how you read Genesis 1 and 2 and
Yeah.
how many, where did um, all of Adam's children come from? Where was the wife?
Mhm.
Where was the wife
Oh, we
of
could.
Cain? This opens up all sorts of questions that would need to be covered elsewhere. but-
Yeah.
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 I hope you're taking notes, Court. We got future episodes.
We'll
Um,
see. We'll see.
But yeah, so where were we? We're talking about languages. Oh,
Yeah.
why does God separate the languages
Yeah.
here?
What's the point of the confusion?
Yeah. And that is a word, that is the word that's used in the
Mhm.
text, is he confuses, he
Confusing.
confounds the languages. I'll tip my hand here and say that I think that the text is less about linguistic origin
Mhm.
Okay.
and more about the separation of people groups. So this is really the Tower of Babel is not the story of the origin of human language diversity. It's the story of the separation of nations. And I think what happens is that God divides the nations and sort of abandons them, so to speak. Now, why would I say that? Well, there are other texts that bear witness on this, so we'll get to that in a moment. But one reason is because what's the context immediately after the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 12?
Abraham.
Abraham.
The call of Abraham.
Yeah.
Right. So what is the call of Abraham? Well, the call of Abraham is when God says, I will make a nation of my
nation,
own,
yeah.
right? Out of this one person.
Yeah.
Right.
It'll be my nation. it'll be my inheritance, to use Mosaic language, right? And so he says, I'm going to make a great and mighty nation from this one person. So we have in Genesis 11, by the way, Genesis 11 in the context falls immediately after Genesis chapter 10, which is the table of nations.
Hmm.
So the table of nations is essentially a listing. It's boring. If you're reading through your Bible plan and you get to Genesis 10, you're like, oh my God, it's just a list of countries, right? And ones I'm not even familiar with. What is this?
Mhm.
Well, it's a listing of all of the known nations in
Yeah.
the known world at the time.
And by the way, when you're reading your Bible, I know the genealogies and the list of different countries
Yeah.
and people and where they can seem kind of like filler and pointless to us.
Yeah.
Those are actually great clues that some sort of change is about to happen,
Right.
Mm.
right? Because it's like taking stock of where we are in general. I mean, this is true in the Gospels,
Yeah.
the
Something
genealogy of
important.
Jesus.
Yeah.
This is true throughout the Old Testament. Every time you have some sort of recording of a genealogy, it means something is going to happen or something has just happened, and the state of play in the world is going to change in a significant manner.
Yeah, there's a major status quo change that's about to happen. And so that's exactly what happens here is they list the nations of the world, and then it's sort of like in nonlinear storytelling in a way. It's like a Tarantino movie. So we have the list of all the nations of the world, and then we get the story of how those nations were separated in the first place, which is Babel.
Yeah.
And then in Genesis 12, we have the call of Abraham to be the nation of God, God's nation. So what's the implication here? We have the separation of the nations into many, and then God's call of a singular nation of his own creation,
Yeah.
which is to suggest God is not messing with the other countries anymore,
Yeah.
the other
Right.
people groups.
At least
Yeah.
not directly.
Not directly, right? His focus is no longer on them.
Yeah.
He is giving them over to something else. In fact, this is precisely what Deuteronomy chapter 32 says, right? I don't have the text right in front of me, but go read Deuteronomy chapter 32 and you'll see where Moses says this when he talks about in the days that the nations were divided according to the number of the sons of God. That's what it says in Deuteronomy 32. Now, what did I say earlier?
Yeah.
The sons of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
The sons of God are supernatural beings.
Yeah.
Now, if you're not reading through that framework, though, you say sons of God, it's like, oh, well, that just refers to humanity. So
Yeah.
they
Right.
just kind of split off into family. No, there's a reason why sons of God is being used there.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're ordered according to the number of the sons of God implies, I think it more than implies, I think it really states that the dividing of the nations wasn't just their separation, but it was their separation and handing over to these supernatural beings, so to speak. Basically, God is having a hands-off approach with these nations, and he says basically, if these people who've gathered here at Babel in disobedience to me, if they want to make contact with other gods, they can have them.
Yeah.
Right. And so he lets the other lowercase g gods have the other nations and says, I'll make a nation of my own
Yeah.
through this man named Abraham. So the call of Abraham is about a fresh start, so
Yeah.
to speak.
It's again a creation
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
And again, bear my image and fill the earth.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the confusion from the languages, I think, resonates with Genesis 1, the earth being formless and void. There's a sort of decreation or uncreated
Yes.
kind of callback there, I think.
Yes, which is exactly what happens in the flood narrative, right?
Yeah.
The return to the primordial waters in the flood. So you actually see this cycle in Genesis where God creates, says it's good, and gives a commission to humanity. And then because of sin, there's a decreation, there's a regression, so to speak, and we return to chaos. The waters are symbolic of chaos, right? And so we have this return to chaos, and then God creates a new creation. And so the new creation in this case is Abraham. Abraham is he's an Adam-like figure in the sense that he is the first of this.
Yeah.
And I want to say one more thing, and then I'll let you guys talk. I know I'm monologuing here a little bit, but
You like to do that.
I
It's
do.
fine.
Yeah.
The yap is powerful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So one thing that sticks out to me is with the call of Abraham, the language that God uses to describe the nation that he will become. And he says, go out of your tent and look to the heavens and see the stars.
Mm-hmm.
And he
Mhm.
does, and he says, you can't count the stars,
Mm-hmm.
right? So will be the number of your offspring.
Right.
Okay. The significance of that is that the stars in the ancient Near Eastern mind are representative of the supernatural beings,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
right? The stars are the gods,
Yeah.
the sons of God,
Yeah.
so to speak,
This
right?
is why, the worship of heavenly bodies is pretty common.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also why the author of the Pentateuch makes it clear in the opening chapters of Genesis that the heavenly bodies are just a created thing
Mhm.
that God created and put there for lights.
Mm-hmm.
That's in contrast to all the other ancient Near Eastern writings that deify these things, right? They say, look, these heavenly bodies are actually supernatural beings. And so you get the mythologizing of the heavenly bodies in Genesis because God says, no, actually, they're just created things I put there for the good of the earth, right?
Yeah.
And so, but because people associate the stars, you get this language, this star language, in reference to supernatural beings throughout Scripture, Old
Mhm.
and New Testament. The bright and morning star,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Right.
Lucifer.
Yeah.
Day star,
Mhm.
right? And so you get this star motif is a reference, not even a veiled reference. It's a pretty explicit reference to the supernatural world. And so God says to Abraham, I'm going to call you, I'm going to make you a great and mighty nation, and your offspring will be more plentiful than the stars of heaven, right? And I think what he's saying is like, well, he's saying a couple of things, right? He's saying, look, the nation I'm going to make out of Abraham is going to supersede the sons of God
Yeah.
who are
Okay. Yeah.
disobedient. That's
Mm.
part of it. And also, I think it's also hinting toward the fact that the nation that I'm creating out of Abraham, I'm going to deify you in some way
Mm.
and make you supernatural,
Mm.
which
Mm.
is something that's hinted at in the New Testament through the glorification of believers.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Wow.
yeah.
I have a segue. Do you have anything else to add? Because I have.
No, I think that's
I,
pretty. Like,
okay.
go to your segue.
Well, so I have to ask. So God confuses the languages at Babel. There has to be a connection to fast forward to the New Testament with Pentecost, where, tongues of fire. Again, we see this parallel. What is there a tie to that, or what are your thoughts on that?
So this is, and Pentecostal theology has made a lot out of this, and probably non-Pentecostal theology too.
Yeah.
The idea is that in Pentecost, in the book of Acts, it describes this a little more in the first couple chapters. You have people from all sorts of different nations coming together in Jerusalem, and there's an event that is sparked in the early church where they start speaking in other tongues. Now, the way this manifests originally is that these people from all over the world are hearing these, people from Jerusalem speaking in their languages that they don't actually know in and of themselves physically.
Mm.
And yet supernaturally, through the power of God, they're able to communicate with these people from all over the world. So it's kind of like a reverse Babel.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too that this is happening in the context of the temple. Even though that's not the primary site of worship for New Testament believers, it's still happening in that context. The temple in Jerusalem is on a mountain. It's high up. It's a place of worship, but it's a proper place of worship. The New Testament church is, in touch with a proper supernatural power, which is the power of God. And so we see this kind of this reverse, this undoing. And in the Bible, you have these themes and these cycles that repeat, but there's always a slight difference.
Yeah.
Right? We're not saying there's perfect symmetry
Right.
between Pentecost and Babel, but we shouldn't expect perfect symmetry.
Yeah.
Because there's not symmetry between good and evil.
Right.
Right? So Babel is going to look one way, right? And not all of the details are going to have an exact match in Pentecost, but that's exactly what we should expect.
Right.
Because in Babel, we have the outworking of evil. In Pentecost, we have the outworking of good.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if your intuition on this is exactly right, Courtney, which is that if you read the text of the book of Acts, the first 2 chapters, what you're going to see is there's some very intentional echoes in the text linguistically that Luke is trying to do. He's actually trying to draw the reader's attention towards the Babel narrative.
Okay.
He uses some of the very same words, and if you look at
Yeah.
this is most clear if you look at the Septuagint, right? So the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so if you look at the Greek words that he uses in those first 2 chapters of Acts, and the Greek words that appear in the Genesis 11 narrative, you're going to see that the people at Pentecost were confounded
Yeah. Yeah.
or confused, right?
Mhm.
It's the same language,
Mm.
except they're confused not because of the scattering of languages, but rather from the uniting of languages.
Yeah.
Right.
They can understand each other.
Right.
Yeah.
And importantly, it doesn't undo the fact that there are different languages,
Right.
but it bridges the gap
Yes.
Yeah.
between them.
Yeah. It brings unity where there was disunity.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's also, I mean, there's so much that you could unpack
Yeah.
there. Maybe when we do the Book of Acts episode that I'm not promising we'll do, we can talk about that. But it's interesting to me what the language is speaking on the day of Pentecost, because it says that the hearers heard in their own native tongue, basically praise, and it was praising the wondrous works of God.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so the speech there at this reverse Babel is putting the attention not even on the apostles or the 120 who are gathered in the upper room,
Mm-hmm.
and not on the hearers or the audience who are there,
Mhm.
but is the speech, the content of the speech is putting the focus back where it should have been in the first place, which is upon God, the one true
Yeah.
God. And this is symbolic of, and it's literal too in the spiritual realm, which is to say that what Pentecost is, it is a reversal of Babel, not just in its storytelling, but in the consequence.
Mhm.
Which is to say, if God has disinherited the nations and abandoned them and handed them over to rebellious supernatural beings, then what God is doing at Pentecost is he's reclaiming the nations
Yeah.
through the gospel.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, they immediately go out and the church is being built. So again, they're
Right.
going out and multiplying and filling the earth with.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's a reclamation of the nations. And if I were to put sort of a pin on what is the gospel, what is the Great Commission, this
Mhm.
essentially is what it is.
Right.
The Great Commission is not just proselytizing. We're not just trying to convert people to our way of thinking or to get people indoctrinated, right? That's not the point. Now, maybe there's an element of some of those things. The point of the Great Commission is literally to reclaim the earth to its original owner,
Mm.
to whom it actually has authority over the earth, to who the nations actually belong, right? There's a significance of why in the Gospels, when Jesus is baptized, by the way, he passes through chaotic waters
Mm.
and comes out a new creation in his baptism. The first thing that he does is he goes to the wilderness, which is another place of chaos, and he encounters the devil who tempts him and offers him what? The kingdoms of the earth,
Right.
Mm.
right? He says, all of these
Yeah.
nations, all the kingdoms of the earth, I'll give them to you. And Jesus, of course, says it is written, and he resists the devil. But the reason why he resists him is because Jesus is saying, I haven't come to receive the nations as a bribe from demonic forces. I've come to take them back by force,
Mm.
Right.
right? I've literally come, there's a new sheriff in town,
Mm.
and I'm reclaiming territory for my purposes. And
Right.
so it's spiritual warfare between two kingdoms,
And that-
between the lowercase g gods and the big G God.
Yeah.
And that offer only makes sense, that I will give you I will give you the kingdoms or the nations of the earth. That only makes sense if there's at least a pretext
Right.
of the fact that the devil and his cronies have some sort of, I'm not going to say right,
Right.
but some sort of prerogative,
Yeah,
some sort of reason why they might think they would have some sort of say in what happens.
exactly. And Jesus says when the scribes and Pharisees accuse him of being Beelzebub and say that, he's casting out demons with the powers of demons and so forth. And one of the things that he says to them is, and there's some Old Testament references in this that are pretty complex, but what he says is that if you're going to plunder the strong man's house, you have to first bind the strong man.
Mm-hmm.
What's the implication? Well, the implication is he's saying, this is what I've come to do.
Yeah.
I've come to steal. I've come to plunder his house. I'm taking what he has.
Yeah.
So the thing that is in possession of the enemy, namely the nations of the earth, are going to belong to me, because
Yeah.
that's who they rightfully belong to in the first place.
Mhm.
So when you share the gospel with someone, when you spread the kingdom of God, we use that kind of language in church, right?
Yeah.
And don't even think about what we're talking about. We're literally talking about broadening the borders of God's kingdom on the earth, so that because the earth is the Lord's and the
Yeah.
fullness thereof.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I have a weird question here. I'm
Yeah.
going to get weird with it.
I love weird questions.
So, you know, is the Tower of Babel an early example? Is there a technological, I don't know, lens that you can look at it through? And part two is, are we in our current age with technology and AI, space travel,
Mm.
are we rebuilding a Tower of Babel?
Oh, good question.
Wow.
I don't know where we're at in time, if this is like
That's
an episode itself or...
Yeah, that's really complicated. And the answer to the first question, I know some people make a lot of hay about Babel must have been tied to some sort of technological innovation or
Mhm.
explosion. I don't really think you can get that from the biblical
Yeah.
text.
Insert the meme with the guy with the funny hair. Aliens.
Yeah, aliens or something, which I think is just a distraction from the main point. Could there have been a certain technological advance associated with it? Of course, but that's not the culprit here.
Yeah, not the
in,
point.
In answer to the second question, are we in danger or on the track to constructing another Babel through AI or through space travel? I would have to say no. Now, with a caveat.
This is interesting because I might totally disagree with Jeremy.
I think so. I think that most technologies in and of themselves are neutral, and I'm a strong subscriber to the idea that do not attribute to malice what can be explained through stupidity or ignorance.
Yeah,
I think as far as on the human level, I'm not talking about the supernatural forces that are still messing around with our world, but on the human level, I think that most people are kind of, AI go burr, AI is cool, that kind of level. And it's like, oh, it's going to help us, optimize our fast food orders so where we can get them a millisecond quicker. I don't think that sort of thing, no matter what the technology is going to lead to a Babel incident. Same thing with space exploration, right? There's nothing unbiblical about wanting to get into, some sort of vehicle and visit some other rocks in our solar system or even outside. However, there is a fringe of the transhuman, post-human movement, as well as certain people in the New Age community who have kind of taken on certain technological innovations as in line with their own sort of views that I think could get us there.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is there are people who think that they're going to make an AI singularity and it will practically, for all intents and purposes, be God, even if they say there are no supernatural beings.
Right.
That distinction, at that point, the distinction between supernatural versus natural is irrelevant.
Yeah.
If they're talking about it as God and some sort of like above human thing that, is going to control our lives for good or for ill, that sort of aspiration to manufacture something like that in our own image, that is
pretty
the
close
Babel
to
impulse.
Yeah.
But I don't think it has to go there. It depends on how much power the people who think like that and want to mold the technology in that direction are going to have.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to try to respond to this in
Hot take.
in a coherent way without taking 3 hours, and so that it makes sense. But this is what I'm going to say to your questions. With respect to the technological aspect of Babel, is there a technological aspect? Yes and no, because it's not so much technology, because as what Jeremy said, I think technology in of itself is neutral. The thing at play here that your intuition may be hitting on, Courtney, is not technology, but unauthorized knowledge. Okay?
Yeah.
This is the problem. The problem here is the attempt to receive knowledge from an unauthorized source. Okay? This is the original sin in Eden.
Yeah.
The tree of what? Of the
Knowledge.
knowledge
Yeah.
of good and evil.
Right.
Right? So the initial sin is the attempt to receive unauthorized knowledge from a divine but not capital G God source.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And so that was the original sin in Eden. And there is reason to believe that there is some of this at play at Babel as well. I mean, the sons of God, this is connected with the sons of God because, if you read things like the book of Enoch, right, which is a speculative text, it's not in our canon, but it's interesting. And the New Testament authors seem to like to reference it and seem to like to make allusions to it, specifically with respect to what the book of Enoch says about the Genesis 6 event. And so what you have is in the book of the Watchers, in the book of Enoch, it is the description of the sons of God who are rebellious in Genesis chapter 6, and what they basically fill in the blanks of what the Genesis 6 version of the story leaves out. So beyond just cohabitating with the daughters of men and producing offspring, the Jewish tradition is that they also received things from these supernatural beings that they shouldn't have had. And the primary thing that they received is knowledge of how to create warfare, knowledge of how to do medicine and science, knowledge of all sorts of things. The advance of secret divine knowledge comes from the source of the Watchers, or the Apkallu if you're an ancient Mesopotamian person, right? And so in the ancient Mesopotamian, the non-Jewish, sort of pagan, ancient Near Eastern mind, the 7 Apkallu are the spirits who were made in the underworld. These are the Watchers. These are the sons of God in the biblical parlance, but in the non-biblical language, these beings are beings who impart to humanity knowledge.
Yeah.
And so it was a very popular thing in the ancient Near East for people to want to connect themselves to the Apkallu or to the Watchers by saying like, "Oh, I'm a descendant of one of the Nephilim," right?
Yeah.
And so why? Because I have access to forbidden supernatural knowledge.
Yeah.
And
But I think we can take that too far
Mhm.
because there's nothing in the Bible that indicates metallurgy, blacksmithing,
Right.
arts and culture is intrinsically evil.
No.
And so what I would say is that, yes, it's possible that these evil supernatural forces, helped spur along these innovations, but that was kind of like a Trojan horse.
Yeah.
There's nothing intrinsic to that knowledge that is bad other than the fact that it's part of this manipulation of the human race.
And it's and the source of its origin, right? Right. When I say unauthorized knowledge, I don't mean to imply that the knowledge itself is bad. What I mean to imply is that the way that it's been accessed or received is problematic because we're swapping what God is giving us for something that a rival rebellious supernatural being might be offering.
Yeah.
And so I'm not anti I'm not a simpleton who wants to take us back to the Stone Ages with no knowledge. What I'm saying is I don't want to close the door to the idea that the Babel event and the Genesis chapter 6 event may be associated with the reception of certain types of knowledge from supernatural beings. This is popular in popular culture. People want to attribute this to aliens, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of this Promethean idea of stealing fire from the gods.
Yeah.
Right?
Which in Aliens is the kind of like explanation.
Yeah, Prometheus.
That lets us be
literally the movie.
Yeah, that lets us be that lets us have our secular cake with but it's really supernatural.
Right, exactly. So that's a common thing that we'll see, and I'm sure we can, in future episodes that I'm not promising, talk about aliens and what the biblical worldview says about that. But this is a common practice in the secular world, is they want this human desire to reach for something metaphysical or something beyond our terrestrial experience. And a lot of times the default thing is aliens,
Yeah.
right? UFO sightings, things like that. Whereas I think a lot of those itches can be scratched, so to speak, and questions can be answered by looking towards a supernatural worldview.
Okay, but back to the topic at hand, though. Are we venturing towards another Babel today?
Mm.
Insofar as seeking knowledge from sources that we should not be seeking it from, possibly in the way that you described, Jeremy, about if we try to construct an AI super god, then
There literally are people trying
oh,
to
I
do
know.
this.
Yeah, this isn't fiction. I know it sounds crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this is for real. I mean, people, and there are very smart, very rich people who are
Yeah.
in these fields who are very concerned about what we might create,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, how omniscient can it be, and how omnipotent might it be. And so, in that sense, that we are, and this is kind of part of the human condition, which is to say, the fundamental brokenness of humanity is that we perform idolatry.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And idolatry is what? Idolatry is the trading of the genuine article for a lesser thing.
Yeah.
Right? That's what idolatry is. We're abandoning the true source of life and knowledge and goodness, in search of something because it's foreign. It catches
Yeah.
our attention, and we search after it, and we give it the devotion and the attention and the worship is really
Yeah.
the key word here, that it doesn't deserve because it's lesser than the
It's a
actual true thing.
counterfeit. Yeah.
So this is what Adam and Eve did in the garden, right? To say, you know, when you eat of this tree, the serpent says, you will become like God.
Mm-hmm.
But what the tragedy is, they were already like God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were already made in his image.
That's right.
And it wasn't that God wanted to hold them back or wasn't going to give them knowledge. It was just that knowledge was outside of his plan. It wasn't necessary at
Right.
that point for their flourishing.
Right.
Yeah.
And the same is, you know, and I think you're right to say that aspiration to continue crossing the boundary is still with us. I mean, these supernatural forces are also still with us.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They're still, and the Bible is very clear about that.
That's right.
Like, this is not some sort of weird, like, you know, Christian cult conspiracy theory. No, like if Revelation, even if you read it highly metaphorically, says that there are still spiritual forces roaming around, and they will continue to roam around and cause mischief up until the very end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the Gospels and the apostolic letters are filled with this, right?
Mhm.
That this is a what we wrestle not against flesh
Yeah,
and
right.
blood, right? That's what that whole thing is all about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Babel is possible today.
Yeah.
Obviously, if it did happen again, I don't think it would happen in exactly the same way or have the same implications,
No.
right? The most that I would be willing to say is that it could have a part to play in the end times
Mhm.
drama, but even that's going a little too far.
Yes, or you could just say generically, like we've been saying, I think, which is that Babel is kind of a thing that's been happening and continues to happen
Yeah.
throughout history.
Right.
And but the good news is, which is what gospel means, is that Jesus's plan of reclaiming the nations and defeating the powers of darkness. This is the important part.
Mhm.
What Christ does upon the cross is an act of war. And it's a paradox because it doesn't look like it. It looks like a defeat. But what he does is he defeats the powers of dark. He disarms the rulers, right?
Mhm.
By doing what he does on the cross, by atoning for sin and by reconciling humanity that has been estranged and separated and abandoned
Mm.
from God.
Yeah.
He has reconciled us through the cross, and in doing so has reclaimed the nations to any who receive the gospel, the good news that this has happened.
Yeah.
And so when Jesus says to telestai, it is finished, yes, he's talking about his work. He's talking about his earthly mission. But what is his earthly mission? It's to reclaim the earth for the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the enemy has already been defeated. So Babel can continue on. Every day, people make that choice
Yeah.
to seek after other gods.
Right.
And yet the one true God is still on the throne and in control.
Yeah.
And in the end, his kingdom shall have no end.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And his nation, his church
Right,
now
right.
is still thriving and,
Yeah.
and going forth.
The
That's right.
church, which by the way, is going to be comprised of people from every nation and people and tongue.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
This was fun. This was good. I
Yeah.
really liked it. Hopefully, if you're listening, you gleaned something.
Yeah.
I feel like I gleaned from you guys. I'm excited for what's to come.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.